The Chicago Bears need to improve both the offensive line and wide receiver this offseason. But if you had to prioritize one of them over the other, which one is more important for Justin Fields?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, we look at which position group is more important for Justin Fields, the offensive line in front of him or the wide receivers he's throwing to. We can kind of go through the case for each group, understanding that they're both important. It's just a matter of which one is above the other, and we'll kind of wrap up with a discussion on positional value and how the Bears may want to approach prioritizing these two positions this offseason. We saw this really prominently with the Cincinnati Bengals a couple of drafts ago, and when they were building around Joe Burrow and trying to decide whether to draft Jamar Chase or Penei Sewell in the first round, the star offensive lineman or the star wide receiver. They went the wide receiver, had very good success with that. I don't think that immediately says, Bears should therefore do wide receiver, but I want to have a more nuanced discussion about it today on the show. I want to start with the offensive line argument, then we'll go to the wide receiver argument, and we'll kind of synthesize those two arguments and make some concluding thoughts at the end. Because when you look at offensive line, having a better offensive line gives Justin Fields more time, and it also improves the running game, which then therefore further helps Justin Fields, right? When we think about what we saw Fields have to go through this season, in those games when the offensive line was struggling, he was quickly under duress and not always able to fully go through, a full progression, to find open receivers downfield, to give receivers time to run their routes and actually get open in their routes. And that as he's going through his progression, there's a certain timing where receivers in any set of route concepts are only going to be open at certain parts of their route. When you run a curl route, the ball's got to be there on the curl, or else once you've curled, then the defensive back knows where you are and can just get closer to you, and that's the end of your route, right? Or when you're working on like a slant route, you kind of win on that cut to the inside. Those are both shorter routes. You kind of have to hit that window right away, or else you kind of have your direction figured out. Whereas a deeper route, like a post route over the middle of the field or a deep corner route, they're not really going to be open so much on the stem of that route. It's not until they make their break, and depending on what coverage they're in, it might be, they've already broken on a post route over the middle of the field. If it's a cover two that you're going against, you're splitting the two safeties, he's not open until he gets in between the two safeties, whereas maybe against some coverages, he's open earlier on his break, right? So there's different timing for each receiver, depending on what their route is, on when they're supposed to be open. And Fields needs the time in order for those receivers to get far enough into their routes to get open. And also Fields needs the time to be able to, get through each read in the progression to get to each part of, the timing of the whole play. And then, of course, he can turn and take off and run if things break down in that regard. But it feels like a quarterback like Justin is someone that needs absolutely as much time as you can give him. We saw this season, and we've kind of talked about it all dating back to when Matt Nagy was running the offense here, that Nagy and them were trying to force him to be more of a quick rhythm decision-making passer, 3 steps, hitch, throw, and really kind of try and speed up that process. And that's really not who he is or what his skill set is. He's much more in the Cam Newton style of, holds onto the ball a little bit longer, but loads up and can fire some big shots downfield. It's not about quick precision footwork and precision ball placement, but giving your guy a chance to be able to make some plays on the ball and being able to generate big explosive plays with a really accurate deep ball. And to get the most out of that Justin Fields skill set, you're going to need time for him to throw to be able to get those accurate deep balls downfield, because again, it just takes time for receivers to run their routes. Even the best receivers in the NFL, you can only get downfield so fast. I mean, you only have so many Tyreek Hills, I guess, that can maybe get downfield a bit faster than everybody else, but it's not realistic to expect like you can just wide receiver your way out of having no pass protection, right? You need a certain base level of pass protection that the Bears had at times this past season, but did not have consistently enough. And that can do so much, so many wonders for a quarterback like Fields. If you don't make him have to speed up, make him have to accelerate that internal clock and make him have to maybe rush decisions or rush through his progressions, and maybe you don't see things as quickly or as clearly or as concretely, and maybe that can lead to more decisions. And give him some of that time to be able to grow in a more ideal pocket environment. That can also help him develop his pocket presence more, so that in the future, if and when the pocket does break down, he's more comfortable operating under those circumstances, as opposed to being constantly surrounded by breaking down pockets and not able to build up and really cement the good habits of good quarterback pocket presence and working from a strong pocket. If he's always in a bad pocket, that's where you can sort of establish and cement some of those bad habits. And I think the more time he can spend in a good pocket, the more he can lock those in and then be able to improvise based off of that when things don't always go as planned. Because even with a great offensive line, that doesn't mean 100% perfect pass protection at all times, but it's about making his job easier and as easy as possible in order for him to be the best quarterback that he can be. Now, at the same time, really good wide receivers can do that too. We've seen prominent examples of quarterbacks getting big boosts at wide receivers and really elevating their level of play. And we've seen examples of quarterbacks having pretty decent offensive lines with not great wide receivers and still not being able to be as productive as you would like them to be, because the talent of the guys that they're throwing to is just not good enough. So coming up, we'll find out why wide receivers can really take a lot of that burden off of the quarterback and be their best friend in a way that seems to be a tried and true method for helping quarterbacks develop and improve. That's next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers right now can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back to you for free in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And even though we're in the football offseason, there's still plenty of different ways to play. You can bet on XFL games, NFL draft futures, awards for next season, plus the basketball season is rounding into the big playoff stretch here coming up, hockey season as well, and so much more, all with FanDuel Sportsbook. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL and NBA. Wide receivers can really take the burden off of the quarterback position and make Justin Fields' life easier, make him look even better than he already is, and really, I think, help us accelerate this idea of quarterback development. That Justin Fields can only control what happens when up to the point of when he lets go of the ball, or I guess up to the point that the ball arrives at the wide receiver, right? Once it gets to the wide receiver, he has no control over that wide receiver catches it or drops it, whether that wide receiver catches it and is tackled immediately, or catches it and makes the first guy miss, or catches it and makes 4 guys miss and runs for 60 yards after the catch for a touchdown. But in all of those outcomes, it's directly reflected on the quarterback. If the receiver drops it, it's an incomplete pass for Justin Fields, even if it was a perfect throw right into the breadbasket that the wide receiver just couldn't hold on to. If the wide receiver catches it and gets tackled right away for 20-yard gain, it's 20 yards for Justin Fields. And if the wide receiver breaks a tackle and runs for 60 and a score, it's 60 yards and a touchdown for Fields, despite him only doing 20 yards worth of the work. Now, of course, sometimes a perfect pass that leads a receiver between two defenders, right? The quarterback's throw can set up the receiver to be more productive after the catch. It's not to say that the quarterback has no influence on what happens after the catch, but generally what happens after the catch is out of his control because his influence still comes on once the ball hits the receiver. It depends on how it hits the receiver, but that's where the quarterback's influence stops. So if you surround a quarterback with receivers that are going to drop a bunch of passes, that are not going to be able to make plays after the catch, and will also consistently struggle to get open before the catch, to not even give him good windows to be able to throw to downfield, then that's how you get Justin Fields, in part with 2,000 yards, 17 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions in 15 games this past season, and why you get a lot of these narratives about, his inability to pass, his inability to see the field, right? The blame and the credit goes to the quarterback when things go well or go poorly, and not enough is attributed directly to the receivers and the roles that they play in that process of Fields. Fields holds onto the ball too long. Is it always because he's too slow to read things, or is he not seeing open receiver? Or are there not open receivers downfield for him to see? If he has a low completion percentage, are receivers not getting open? Are receivers dropping passes? Are receivers forcing him to attempt more difficult tight window throws? Is he just missing, right? There's always that sort of line there of where the blame goes. It's like, oh, well, Fields isn't completing this, but how much of that can go to the wide receivers? Certainly the offensive line is a factor in this, but the wide receivers can make such a world of difference for a quarterback. I mean, look at Jalen Hurts with the Philadelphia Eagles. Obviously, the Eagles had a great offensive line, and this is not to say this is like the perfect example, but they made it a priority to trade for A.J. Brown and to draft Devonta Smith in the first round after they had a pretty poor wide receiving core generally this past season. The season before, I should say, we're already past the season. They've had a pretty decent offensive line around him. These are all guys that they drafted. They still kept adding to it, and so it's not to say that the offensive line was as good the last 2 years, but they had an always pretty good offensive line and not great receivers. They add the receivers and keep the good offensive line, and the Eagles take part of that big step forward because you get big weapons for Hurts that can make the quarterback right even when he's wrong, or can just make the quarterback even more right and get even more bang for your buck on every pass attempt that he does, because they can squeeze every possible yard out of every possible passing play. I think comparatively to like Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay, where not that their offensive line has always been stellar, but we've seen the last couple of seasons how once Devontae Adams was gone, especially, they don't have a ton at wide receiver. And until Christian Watson emerged a bit later on in the season, he was struggling out there. And we know that Aaron Rodgers is a Hall of Fame quarterback. We know that offensive line had injuries and can take some of the blame there. But we also know when that offensive line was healthy, they had some real talent with Bakhtiari and Jenkins and Myers and et cetera, et cetera. And Rodgers just couldn't find open players. They couldn't get the offense going nearly to the extent that we've come to expect from them. I mean, Rodgers was still able to do some Aaron Rodgers level things. It still had, 3,600, 3,700 yards or so, and has still been able to be productive despite not having a lot at wide receiver. But you see just how big of an impact, even on a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback, not having the wide receiver can have when he goes from MVP candidate to guy the fan base is ready to trade away and move on from because they don't think he's that great or worth continuing to kind of work down for. So it's easy to get excited and say, man, if you could add a number one receiver for Justin Fields, how big of a difference that would make in this offense. When it's third down and he needs someone to go to, and he doesn't have to just keep running for his life and having to make all these massive plays with his legs because he doesn't have receivers open downfield. He doesn't have guys who are able to make these plays with him. I mean, the highlight reel plays this season for the Bears were Fields running and then Khalil Herbert and David Montgomery running, or a coverage bust where a wide receiver is wide open because the defense lost him, mostly because of Justin Fields' legs, and he throws it to Dante Pettis for 50 yards, but Pettis was not open because he ran great routes or because he was an explosive player or a great wide receiver. It was mostly because of Justin Fields and the things he was able to do. But imagine pairing him with solid, great wide receivers, and even if the offensive line isn't great, he can extend the plays with his legs, and he can create some more time for those receivers and be able to load up and fire plays downfield outside of the pocket and do some of the playmaking ability that we've seen him be able to do. I mean, think of Tua Tagovailoa and the Miami Dolphins as well with Hill and Waddle. Like building the wide receivers up around a quarterback who either is struggling or just needs to take some further steps forward, we've seen that be a fairly tried and true method for that quarterback development opportunity. So again, it's kind of this split of like, yeah, it's really important to give a quarterback a better offensive line. That's super helpful. And it's really important to give a quarterback better wide receivers because that's super helpful and can be a cheat code and a security blanket for these wide receivers or for these quarterbacks. So, when you're trying to divvy up the salary cap space and say, okay, what do we go sign? Where do we prioritize this? Or draft picks or a potential trade for a premium player at one of these positions. You can't just add best players, great players at every position and bolster every spot. Sometimes you have to make these kind of tough decisions on what you should prioritize. You can still add at both, but what should you prioritize and how you should prioritize it. I think that there's a certain aspect of Justin Fields' game that leans me in one direction of these positions over the other, but I also think the way you approach them in free agency should be different based on positional value and almost a little bit irrespective of Justin Fields. So I'll explain these sort of competing dynamics of team building with Fields' skill set and also positional value next on Locked On Bears. Justin Fields as a runner and his mobility and his need to hold on to the ball at times and want to be a playmaker makes the offensive line's job more difficult compared to a quick rhythm passer who gets rid of the ball, like Tom Brady, right? Can get rid of the ball in 2.5 seconds, and the offensive line doesn't need to hold up all that long. And in that case, with a quick rhythm passer like that, you need the wide receivers then to be able to make plays because you're getting rid of the ball so quickly, you don't have time for plays to go downfield. But I also think Justin Fields makes the wide receivers' jobs a little bit easier at the same time. Makes the offensive line job a little harder and makes the wide receiver job a little easier. And so to me, it feels like that points to offensive line being more important for Justin Fields. Because if you think about it, we talked about it there briefly with Dante Pettis. It was kind of limited. It was kind of lingering in the wide receiver argument that when Justin Fields extends plays with his legs and gets out of the pocket, that gives the wide receivers more time and makes it more difficult for defensive backs to cover these wide receivers. Even if the wide receivers themselves are not Pro Bowl stellar players, the cornerbacks and safeties can only hold up in coverage for so long. They can only keep all areas of the field locked down for so long. And so often we saw plays, even this last season, when the wide receivers weren't good, but Fields is rolling out of the pocket, scrambling, moving to one side, rolling up to the other side, and he's able to find somebody open somewhere. And that receiver wasn't open because Equanimous St. Brown ran this great route, and that's because that's what made him wide open. It was Fields ran around so much that defensive backs couldn't stay with everybody and also had to start coming and accounting for Fields scrambling, and they leave a wide receiver wide open. So in that sense, it feels to me like it's more important to give Justin Fields more time to throw than it is to give him the best wide receivers in football. Again, still important to give him better wide receivers and will help him tremendously. But I think if I had to prioritize one slightly over the other, if I could give him the best offensive line group in the NFL or the best receiving core in the NFL, I find myself feeling like overall offensive line is more important for Justin Fields. That if you give him time, he can find somebody open and he can use it. When he extends plays and the longer he has in the pocket, the more likely somebody is going to get open just because of the amount of time that it's going to take. But I don't know that hypothesis, right, or this conclusion, this idea that I think offensive line is more important for Justin Fields than wide receiver. I don't know if that would inform exactly, though, how I go about building this Bears team. And that's kind of the conundrum here because of the positional values there. And overall, I believe a really, like, if you needed to, if we're talking about team building, and can I add either one really good offensive lineman or one really good wide receiver? One really good wide receiver makes a much bigger impact on your team than one really good offensive lineman. So in that regard, I would prioritize a number one wide receiver over prioritizing building up the offensive line if I'm Ryan Poles and the Bears this offseason, even though I think the offensive line is more important for Justin Fields. Because when you think about the value of the offensive line, if you're an opposing defensive coordinator will try and attack your pass protection, he's always going to try and attack the weakest spot on your offensive line, right? Where can we win? Where can we get our best matchups? How can we get to the quarterback in the easiest possible way? We will look for their worst offensive lineman. So your offensive line, what's most important is how good your worst guy is, to not have that big hole. And I believe that like adding a Pro Bowl left tackle is not that important if you still have a really bad right tackle, because they're just not going to go after that Pro Bowl left tackle. Or, adding that Pro Bowl left tackle when center's not very good. Like, it's more important to have all of your offensive line reach a threshold than to go out and get a really, really good offensive lineman, because it's about the lowest common denominator. Your weakest link is what's most important on your offensive line. Get all 5 of your linemen to a certain level, and that's what's most important, as opposed to wide receiver, where adding one dynamic individual wide receiver can be such a huge individual impact. But adding one really, really great offensive lineman does not fix your whole offensive line. It has to be a whole line operation there. And so if my choice is add a great receiver, add a great offensive lineman, I'm adding the great receiver every time. But I think overall, I would rather build up my whole offensive line than build up my whole receiving core, right? But if I can add that one wide receiver, if it's a 1-to-1, it's like say the Bears trade down in the first round. Let's make it a concrete scenario. They trade down to 7 or 9 or whatever, the Panthers pick, and you got a really good offensive tackle like Peter Skronsky, or you got a really good wide receiver like Quentin Johnson or Jackson Smith-Njigba or whoever. I haven't done enough like in-depth scouting on both of them to say like, oh, one is greatly better than the other, but like I find myself, if I believe the wide receiver prospect in the draft is a number one guy who could be a dynamic playmaker for your offense that you just don't have, I'm taking him over the first round caliber offensive lineman, because I can fill my offensive line with second and third round guys that are still going to be very good and help bring up the low end of my offensive line, because the low end of my offensive line is more important than the high end of my offensive line. But the high end of my wide receiver is a lot more important than the low end of my receiver. And so it's more about the building the position group and the value of 5 guys as opposed to the value of one guy at wide receiver. Does that make sense? It's like O-line, 5 O-linemen is more important for Fields than one wide receiver. But if I'm trying to decide between adding one offensive lineman and one wide receiver, that one individual wide receiver is going to be more important than that one individual offensive line. So like overall, I would prioritize my resources more generally towards offensive line. But if I have the opportunity to add a difference maker at wide receiver, good players at wide receiver individually make more of an impact than any one good player on the offensive line. But I think 5 good players on the offensive line would make a bigger impact than 5 good players at wide receiver. Wide receiver is more top-heavy important. Offensive line is more bottom-heavy important. And that's where I think you have to sort of balance what's important for Fields and which is better for him, which I think is offensive line, and what's better for the team building process and resource allocation, which is a number one wide receiver is a more bang for your buck than a number one left tackle or a number one right tackle. But you can't leave a big hole at center or at right tackle or at left guard if you cut Cody Whitehair and expect Fields to be able to have the same success. I think if you just got a wide receiver and left holes in the offensive line, you would be more screwed than if you left a hole at the number one wide receiver spot and solidified the heck out of that offensive line, because one wide receiver can only make up so much when the offensive line is truly terrible. And we've seen that over the years in Chicago as well with some of the bad offensive lines, even when they've tried to get good wide receivers in here. And it only goes so far. So that's kind of where this process goes. And it's really an interesting debate that Ryan Poles and company are going to have to go through this offseason. I would love to hear where you stand on the matter. What's more important for the Bears to build the team and for the Bears to support Justin Fields? Good offensive line, good wide receivers, a number one wide receiver, a top 5 offensive line. How do you balance those things? Let us know in the comments on this YouTube video. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. Tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can email lockedonbears@gmail.com as well. We'd love to hear from you and what you think on the podcast here. Just make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to Locked On Bears. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, NFL draft season is right around the corner. The NFL Scouting Combine is this week. Go check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We actually have two new hosts on Locked On NFL Draft, Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Those dudes are great. They're from the Draft Network. They've got good energy, good vibes, and great NFL draft analysis. So if you haven't checked out Locked On NFL Draft in a while, go check out these new guys. They're pretty fun, and I'm happy to have them here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're going to have them on the Locked On Bears podcast once we get closer to draft season to look at some of these different prospects and scenarios for the Chicago Bears. So get to know them on their podcast now. Then come on back for another episode of Locked On Bears tomorrow and throughout the rest of the week. Every single week, 5 days a week. We're going to be your opportunity each and every day to bear down.